The BIS, Bank of International Settlements, and IMF, International Monetary Fund, have just issued warnings that the Eurozone and the emerging markets will not survive a major crisis if there's a panic in the bonds markets. Harley Schlanger is in Germany, speaks with top officials, and knows exactly what China and the U.S. will look to achieve in these regions using their deep state operatives. This is a fantastic interview on geopolitics. Enjoy.
Recording. Welcome to the Times of Industry show, and I have a very exciting interview for everyone today. Harley Schlanger is in Germany right now, and we're going to get a great taste of what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the Chinese connection to Europe, how it all plays out in the grand scheme of things with the U.S. And Harley is a very well-known commentator, economist for the Schill Institute and the LaRouche PAC. And we're in for a pleasure because this is going to be very authentic, very original. He's a very good thinker, and his opinions are always very thought-provoking. Harley, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to be back with you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it definitely has been a while, too long. In fact, I love reading your work. And I would just love to jump in and ask you first thing about the hottest thing on the plate right now, which is Russiagate. What do you think about it?
Well, as you probably know, and some of your viewers, I've been writing for 2 years that the Russiagate thing was a fraud from the start. It had nothing to do with anything either the Russians did or Trump did, but it had to do with a gang in the Obama administration and the old Bush crowd, as well as with their allies in British intelligence, being very fearful that Trump was about to break the old geopolitical deal, which was that Europe and the United States align against Russia and China to protect the financial system which is bankrupt, and to prevent the emergence of another monetary system. And so what we've seen was more than 2 years of lies, of corruption, some of which has been exposed. But the report itself is completely inadequate in rehabilitating Trump. And I say this not as someone who is a gung-ho Trump supporter, but as a patriotic American who's watched our nation be put through hell because the Obama crowd, the Clinton crowd, the Bush crowd, and the British crowd didn't want to accept the verdict of the American people in November 2016. So I would caution people about getting too excited about the Mueller report. It does say no collusion, which Trump has insisted from the beginning, but it still says that the Russians were meddling. Now, my belief is that the foremost authority on this question is Bill Binney, the former NSA technical advisor who was run out of office, run out of his position, and had to become a whistleblower because he was talking about the corruption of the National Security Agency. Binney has done the forensic investigation that the FBI never did, that crowdsourced never did. It was never done on the DNC computers and so on. And he concluded that it was not a hack, but an inside job. And his work is available if people just want to Google Bill Binney. But this is important because the whole Russiagate was designed to keep Russia as an enemy of the United States. And the fear was that Putin would be able to manipulate Trump into doing things that were beneficial to Russia. Well, the fact is Trump was trying to do things that are beneficial for the United States, like ending wars, ending regime change, ending confrontation with Russia and China. And one would hope that now that the report has come out and Russiagate has been proven to be a fraud from the beginning, from the whole time, that one would hope that Trump would be able to get on with the business he ran for president to do. I'm just afraid that you have a gang in the Democratic Party working with people in the Republican Party who are so committed to the old geopolitical world of confrontation, of arms buildup, of regime change, of false flags, and so on, that they're not going to drop it. They're not going to let it go. So I would simply say that the American people have now seen that even with the corruption of the FBI, the CIA, the Justice Department, and especially the US media. They had nothing on Trump. Now we've got to demand that the people who did this pay the price, that the investigations turn on the Brennans and the Clappers and Obama and Hillary Clinton and the Susan Rice and others, so that we can clean up the corruption, so that we can actually have a government that works for the American people.
Now, okay, let's talk about the elections that are coming next year. There's definitely seems to be like it's a vacuum. Like Trump is operating in a situation where there's Trump, and we don't even know who the Democrats want to put, because Trump has dominated the airwaves and social media, the mainstream. It looks like he's been in office for 40 years. He's going to be there for another 40 years. So
does it remind you at all of 2016 when he went through 16 Republican candidates and then Hillary Clinton? I mean, Trump is a bit of a phenomenon, but what makes it work is that the American people, just like the people in Western Europe, are deeply dissatisfied with their governments. I think it's important for Americans to realize that what we saw in the 2016 election was exactly what happened in the United Kingdom with Brexit. It's what brought about a new government in Italy, in Austria, votes that brought in Duterte in the Philippines. It's that people don't trust the existing elites. In Germany, the major political parties in the last election had their lowest percentages in the case of the Social Democrats since 1888, and the Christian Democrats since 1948. And yet the SPD and the CDU are still in the government because no one else has support. So you're absolutely right about the election. You have a bunch of Democrats who sound a lot like Hillary Clinton, but are trying to make it seem as though they're not Hillary Clinton. And Trump is going to tear them apart. And now that they have nothing to go with on impeachment, the question is going to be, what have they done for the last 2.5 years while Trump was trying to deal with Russia, China, North Korea, the financial system, taxes, trade agreements, and so on? All they can say is they were trying to get rid of Trump. So I think this is shaping up nicely for Trump. The only question is, will he do what he needs to do now?
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about the continent that you're currently in, Europe. You have the three largest countries, obviously the four largest countries, I should say, Germany, France, England, and Spain. They're all scrambling in their own little pot of shit. Germany's flirting with recession. You have the UK looking at the Brexit. You have the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy talking about repatriating gold from the central bank, turning the central bank and the financial regulator into zeros. And in France, you have yellow vests. You have immigration out of control, illegal immigration out of control. And they are a big trading partner of China. So the fact that China is stimulating right now on record amounts could be taking Europe out of this mini recession, this mini slump that they're having. And weakening the U.S. dollar and strengthening the euro as a consequence. But in general, talk a little bit about what's going on right now in Europe, because that continent is always overlooked and ignored by the media. They always focus on about the U.S. and China, and they give little room for what's going on in Europe. But that continent is by far more important than many of the emerging markets. 20% of the world's currency is the euro. It's the second largest in importance after the US dollar. So, what's going on right now in Europe?
Well, you're right about the importance of Europe, but the problem is the Europeans have shot themselves in the head by sticking to the euro and sticking to the European Central Bank, which don't really function. I would disagree that we're looking at a possible mini recession. I think we're looking at a potential blowout in Europe. The place to start in looking at it is Deutsche Bank, because here you have the largest bank in Germany. The German economy is at 0% growth for this year so far. Productivity is falling. You've got the insane energy policy. Not only are they exiting nuclear, but they're going to get out of coal. And they have windmills and solar panels all over the place, and they have to buy energy from the Czech Republic whenever it's cold and not sunny. So the German situation is in a terrible shape. And now they're trying to get around the European Union banking regulations to save Deutsche Bank by having it merge with Commerzbank, which is partly owned, almost I think 40% owned by the German government. So under EU regulations, governments can't bail out banks. However, if they own a bank, they can pour money into it. And so what they're going to try to do is merge those two banks, which is sort of like two stumbling drunks leaning up against each other to stay on their feet. But more importantly, they're going to protect the unsustainable assets, the bad debt held by Deutsche Bank, by taking deposits from the Commerzbank savers and business accounts. Commerzbank is much more liquid than Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has $43 trillion in derivatives obligations. They have very high levels of corporate debt that can't be rolled over anymore. Now, you add to that the United States situation. The total indebtedness in the Western economy is 60% higher today than it was in 2008. And 40% of that debt is now triple B rated. This is corporate debt now. Triple B rated, one step above junk bond. All you need is one domino to fall and the whole thing can crash. So what do you see? You see governments in chaos, and they're trying to suppress what we're seeing as the national or the patriotic revolt that's going on. And the Italy case is the best place to start. The Italians are basically saying, we're a sovereign nation. You won't let us deal with our banking situation. You're going to make us bail out Deutsche Bank by paying all our debt up front and not spend a penny for the Italian people. And the government is saying they're not going to do it. And they just had China President Xi Jinping for a 2-day visit to Rome. They signed a memo of understanding between China and Italy, which caused the British press, the German press, the French press to go crazy. Then Macron had invited Xi Jinping, and Macron was saying he didn't like what the Italians did. And the Italians basically said, well, the French people don't like what you're doing, as you mentioned, the Yellow Vest movement in France. So because Macron is in trouble with Xi Jinping, he called on his good buddy Merkel to join him for a meeting tomorrow, and also Juncker, the non-entity who heads the European Union. The three of them are going to meet with Xi Jinping, and they're going to tell him, we don't want you to divide Europe. And Xi Jinping is going to tell them, you're the ones who are dividing Europe. You're the ones causing the British to leave, the Italians to be on the verge of leaving, and so on. So the situation in Europe is, I mean, living here, it's fascinating to watch because you're seeing the same kind of meltdown of the political parties that's occurred with the Democratic and Republican Party in the United States. And the reason I say the Republicans as well is that most of the Republicans were sort of hoping that Trump would get nailed by Mueller and they'd get rid of him. A lot of the Republicans, including McConnell, Paul Ryan when he was in there, were not doing a thing to help Trump. So the political parties are what? They represent banking and financial interests, and they'll do anything they can to make sure they can bail out the unsustainable levels of debt of the big banks and financial institutions. And with Brexit, it's going to be very difficult to protect the London banks. Deutsche Bank, as I said, is in trouble. The Italians are saying they're going to solve their banking situation by getting credit from China to start investing in infrastructure and investing in small and medium-sized business. And this is the way to go. I think the Austrians are doing the same thing. So what are the French going to do? What are the Germans going to do? What are the British going to do? Theresa May is probably the longest running lame duck prime minister they've ever had.
Let's talk a little bit about China. They've run record stimulus just recently, and their stock market is by far the one that has crashed most in 2018. The trade deal, or the lack thereof, has forced the Chinese to hoard a lot of dollars. And on the flip side, a trade resolution, a deal, an end to the trade war would make the situation where they wouldn't need a lot of treasury debt They wouldn't need to hold. There's a deal. Why would
Yeah,
you need to hold foreign currency?
yeah.
Ray Dalio has talked about this. Billionaire Larry Fink, founder of BlackRock, has talked about this a lot. The fact that the U.S. is basically creating a situation where its lenders, 40% of its lending is coming from foreign investments. No other country can even come close to that. They don't need the U.S. dollar anymore. So we're seeing a de-dollarization already from the year 2000 until today. There's a 10% reduction in world currency in terms of the U.S. dollar, even with all the money printing. In 2000, it was 70% of the world's currency. Now it's 60% of the world's currency. And the yuan, remember, is only 1%. So in other words, there is literally no reason for the Chinese, when their currency makes up 1.5% of the world's currency, to keep hoarding dollars. Where is the U.S. dollar going with this in mind?
Well, I think the Chinese don't mind seeing the stock market bubble pop in China because the Chinese government is essentially anti-speculation. And remember, after 2008, they jailed a bunch of bankers, the ones who were saying that the Chinese need to open their banking system to the West and need to get involved with exotic financial instruments such as derivatives and swaptions and so on. The Chinese don't want that. So here's the interesting thing to think about. And very few Americans have any idea of what China is doing. China is stimulating, but where's that money going? With the Western quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve policy, the Bernanke-Yellen policy, the Draghi policy at the European Central Bank, and so on, they're creating large amounts of cheap money or free money to the banks that are going into speculation. They're going into stocks. They're going into back up bad assets. Now, that's like using a credit card to pay a mortgage. All you do is increase the debt. And that's what I said earlier. The OECD pointed out a 60% increase in financial and commercial debt since 2008. What the Chinese are doing is they're investing in building new cities, building dams, power plants, high-speed rail systems that are connecting China with South Asia, China with India, China with Pakistan. They're heavily involved in Africa, and now they're going to be involved in rebuilding some ports in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Greece. They're going to be involved in lending money for the Austrians to change their railway gauge so it will be compatible with the New Silk Road rail coming from China through the Trans-Caucasus and Central Asia. So the Chinese are making a big gamble, which is that if you invest in physical product, you'll ultimately get a return that will enable you to handle the debt. But if you create credit for the sake of paying debt, you'll never, ever solve that problem. And in the West, we're in a permanent cycle of financial bubbles, recessions, and then new bubbles, creating new debt, not to build anything. Productivity is stagnant for 30 years and 20 years in the US. The numbers of people in real productive jobs in the US are at the lowest level since the Great Depression. It's different in China. So the question in an economy is, how do you use credit to add real value to your GDP as opposed to funny money, as opposed to notations on a computer? And that's what the Chinese are doing. And if it works, they're creating the largest consumer market in the world. Xi Jinping has said that the Chinese goal is to have 300 million people in the middle class by 2022, to eliminate poverty in China, the official UN poverty level, to put everyone above that by 2020. And they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. What was the policy of Obama and G.W. Bush in the United States? What did it do? We devastated the middle class with the Obama policy, devastated wealth in the African American community and the Hispanic community. The so-called recovery of Obama was a recovery for billionaires. And it may have created some jobs, but it did nothing to alleviate the poverty. In fact, it worsened it in the United States. So I would say, if you're looking at this situation and you hear all these talks, people say, well, China's creating a debt trap for Africa. I have the benefit, being in Berlin, of meeting with African leaders, including ambassadors in Berlin, but also presidents of several African nations. And I've asked them, do you consider the money that the Chinese are loaning you for infrastructure a debt trap? And they laugh and they say, we're a sovereign nation. We'll decide what we're going to do with it. But the Chinese are helping us. And they say, look, we want German technology and engineering, but we don't want German arrogance and we don't want Western banking. And so we're seeing growth rates starting to pick up in Eastern Africa. Ethiopia is almost 10% a year. Kenya, they're building rail connections north and south, east and west. So I think the Chinese are doing something that will work. That's why there's a panic against them. That's why when Xi Jinping went to Italy, the European Union tried to stop the meetings, tried to stop them from signing a memo of understanding. Now here you have the irony, the European Union is supposedly democratic, and the Italian government, which was elected democratically, decides to form an alliance with China, and the EU says you're not allowed to do it. And the Chinese said, or the Italians rather, said, screw you, this is what we're doing. So will it work? I think it will, because I think physical economy is what we used to do so well in the West. New technologies based on scientific discovery, research and development, enabling us to bring in new technologies that increase the productivity of the labor force so you could pay higher wages, create more consumers, and build an economy. We stopped doing that after 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off gold. We ended the fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods and went into a casino economy. Either we're going to get out of that, and the way to get out of it would be for Trump to finish this deal with China, recognize that the Chinese do have dollars. You know what the Chinese should do with that? They should start investing in American infrastructure. We need some high-speed rail in the United States. We need new airports. We need new dams. We need new locks on the canals. We have a tremendous infrastructure deficit, and that's the way to create jobs that will pay decent wages. And I know that this is something that Trump has talked about. So maybe with the Russiagate off his back, and maybe with the election coming up, he can go back to some of his campaign promises, which would include cooperation with Russia and China, forcing Europe to adopt fair trade agreements with the United States, and then from there, being able to protect the American workforce, as opposed to what was done under Bush and Obama with these crazy free trade deals.
How did he decide to cut taxes then? If the obligations are so enormous, and you see now that they're going to hit $1.1 trillion annual deficit, what's behind it? Do you think that the probably one of the most powerful men, if not the most powerful man in the world, sat there with hundreds of his advisors and sub-advisors and everything and said, okay, we'll just cut taxes to kick the can down? Is this the sort of mentality that the U.S. government has to say, okay, let's cut taxes, get another year of higher GDPs and get our approval ratings up? Is this where thousands of hours of think tanks go to? Or what is the rationale behind cutting taxes? Does he think that you will grow out of this situation? It boggles the mind on one hand that
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But here's the point. Who's been calling for lowering the tax rate? This is the Koch brothers. This is the American Enterprise Institute. These are the neoliberal, so-called free trade organizations that Trump campaigned against. And this is what Goldman Sachs wants. This is what the offshore banking community wants. And I think Trump made a big mistake in the tax cut. And I think it was partly because he was trying to get some kind of victory. But I think it's also that he believes the story that if you cut tax rates, it will magically increase sales and production and it will flow into new industry and so on. And he made a mistake on that. He should have studied what John Kennedy wanted to do with the investment tax credit. What Kennedy said is, we'll give you a tax credit, but you have to do something in return. He said this to the corporations. You have to create new plant and equipment, new jobs, job training, fund research and development. If you do that, you get a tax credit. And for the limited amount of time that Kennedy was able to do that, it had an enormously positive effect. Now, what Trump was convinced by people like Mnuchin and as I mentioned, all these neoliberal think tanks, was to give the corporations the money that they could bring back to the United States in the tax cuts and no requirement for what they do with it. In other words, free enterprise, free market. And what does the free market do? It goes for the quickest return. And what was that? Corporations bought their own stocks. And corporations that were losing money in terms of sales and were falling behind in many areas saw their stocks soar. And companies like Amazon and the whole artificial intelligence and Google and all these companies, their stocks went through the roof. I mean, Jeff Bezos has more money than probably 30 nations in the world. So I think this was a mistake by Trump. Now, how do you resolve it? Well, I think the first thing he has to do is restore Glass-Steagall. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche had been arguing going back to when Bill Clinton and the Congress got rid of Glass-Steagall in 1999. You have to separate between commercial banking and investment banking so that you're never again in a situation where investment bankers can use the deposits of customers, whether they're savings or mortgage money or savings accounts, checking accounts, and so on. They can never use that money again as a backstop for bad investments. That investment banks would have to eat their losses. And you protect the commercial banks for the sake of having the potential to generate credit through the commercial banks to their customers, especially small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. So Trump, he came out in September 2016 for Glass-Steagall in a famous speech in Charlotte, North Carolina. Maybe it was the beginning of October. And he said a few times he's considering that. Were he to do that, it would begin to make up some of the ground that was lost with the tax cut and would enable him to generate then some kind of credit policy from the government to launch major infrastructure, which would then have returns by increasing the overall production in the United States, so you could begin to whittle away at the deficit. Now, the other thing on the deficit, and this is just very quickly, Trump, when he went to Helsinki to meet with Putin, one of the major points they wanted to discuss, and they did discuss, was not getting into a new arms race. And what was the reaction of the media? Trump is Putin's puppet because he didn't confront Putin on meddling. And therefore, since that time, we've seen a pull out of the INF agreement. We've seen Russia and the United States escalating their arms expenditure. The US, it's absurd. It's almost $800 billion, and that's the official budgetary total going into defense. That's bigger than the next 12 economies in the world spend on defense. So this is insane. And hopefully, if Trump can sit down with Putin, sit down with Xi Jinping, get the trade agreement with China, get a new a direction in arms agreements. And by the way, Trump is working with Putin and Xi Jinping when it comes to North Korea. That was sabotaged by people like Bolton. So I think the other thing Trump has to do is get rid of Bolton. So those are three tasks I give him: Glass-Steagall, sitting down with Putin and Xi, and firing John Bolton, and probably have Bolton take Pompeo out the door with him.
Harley, what do you do with your own money? What does the average investor do right now in terms of his portfolio? Is there anything different from this year to the last year, or from this year to 2008, 2009, 2010, etc.? Do you change your portfolio outlook, your diversification model as reality changes, or is it more or less fixed? What do you do right now? Are you expecting any recession? There was a yield inversion. Talk to us a little bit about just common basic investing.
Well, I'm not an investment counselor and don't pretend to be, but I think people have to be very cautious right now, because I think we're being set up for a big stock market correction, much bigger than we saw at the end of last year. And I think we're also headed toward a very serious shutdown of a number of corporations. The Bank for International Settlements estimates that because of this credit policy, the unsustainable debt of corporations, we could see 20 to 25% of major companies go through bankruptcy in the next 12 to 18 months. So I don't think there's anything that's safe. What I would argue that people should do is fight like hell for a change in the policy. Because ultimately the problem an investor has is the more you hunker down to take care of yourself, the less energy you have to put into changing the policy. And I think we need a change in policy as the most important thing if you're going to have anything left. Because if you look at what happened in 2008, people took a beating in everything. The housing, people who thought they were safe because they had money in their house, they lost. People who went with second mortgages to get money to buy stock, they got slaughtered. The bond markets, people lost. So there's nothing that's safe when you head into this kind of overall volatility, other than to change the policy so that we actually have an investment policy which emphasizes physical production. And the front end of that right now is infrastructure, and then new research and development in major industries. We need an industrial revolution in the United States.
Harley,
Now,
where can people check out?
Just one other thing quickly.
Yeah,
one company that is looking pretty good, if the U.S. were to go with the Belt and Road Initiative of China, would be Caterpillar, because they've positioned themselves to be involved in some of the infrastructure. And there are a number of other companies that are looking at that and that have been going over to China. So that's the one thing that I would say is a potential growth area. But if the U.S. joins with some of these European countries to destroy the Belt and Road Initiative, that wouldn't work either.
Understood. Where can people get more of your articles, more of your blogs?
Well, anyone who wants to get my blog, I do a weekly article. Just write to me directly at harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail. And I'll send you a link to my blog, and you can sign up for free and spread it around. And as I say, my concern is primarily getting out quality intelligence so that people can make the right decisions when it comes to politics.
Thank you. And I think that's very important. Harley Schlanger, thank you very much for taking the time today.
It's good talking with you.
And we're off the air. Okay, Harley.
All right. I hope you found some interesting thoughts there.
Definitely, man. Definitely. And we'll have it posted in a few days.
All right. Well, just send me a link so I can see.
Okay. No problem. Not at all.
All right. Great talking to you, Lior.
Thank you. Bye, sir.
Bye.
The Federal Reserve is frantic to create inflation. It knows that if in this scenario, the unemployment at its lowest level in decades, and after a 10-year economic boom, all of the credit it created can't stimulate velocity, then a downturn, a deflation, could be meaningful and deep. You'll see Jerome Powell doing all he can to get higher inflation rates, and you'd better be ready. Go to wealthresearchgroup.com/goldplaybook now.